Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 7 about the judicial branch. It's Lesson 12 about judicial power. In this lesson, you'll learn about judicial review, about the Supreme Court case of Cooper versus Aaron, about judicial activism, and about the power of interpretation. Previously in this course, we discussed the balance of power between the three branches of government at the time of the founding. It was assumed at that time that the legislative branch would be the most powerful and that the judicial branch would be the weakest. We can see this in this quote from Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, who said that the judiciary would be the least dangerous branch of the national government. Now, why would he say that? Because he argued the judiciary had neither sword nor purse. What he meant by that was they don't have an army to force people to obey their decisions, and they don't have money to go buy an army to force people to obey their decisions. So they merely have to use their best judgment and hope that the people will respect them enough to follow what they say. While Hamilton thought that the judiciary would be weak, not everyone at this time agreed with him. You may recall earlier in this course we talked about the anonymous anti-federalist who called himself Brutus, who wrote a series of letters to newspapers in New York, particularly arguing with Hamilton and James Madison, who were also writing letters. Brutus, speaking of the federal courts, the United States Supreme Court and the other courts that would be created under the Constitution, argued that they wouldn't confine themselves to any fixed rule, as he says here. In other words, they would ignore what the actual text and words of the Constitution might be, and instead they would make their decisions according to what they believed to be the spirit of the document. Now, the reason that this would raise a concern for him is that once you start using something as vague as spirit, essentially a judge could say, well, I know what the words seem to say. If you got out the dictionary and looked up those words, you would think they mean this. But that isn't what they were meant to mean. The idea behind the document, the spirit behind it, what it's trying to accomplish, should cause us to read those words some other way than what they seem to obviously mean. Now, once a judge has been empowered to make those kind of decisions, then he's kind of free to say they mean anything that he wants. And Brutus argued that this power of the judges to interpret the words of the Constitution however they wanted, the words of laws however they wanted, would make them independent of the people, independent of the legislature, even independent of heaven itself. They, in a sense, would become all-powerful. Hamilton disagreed with this. He wrote back to Brutus and said, oh, come on. There's nothing in the Constitution that says they can interpret it according to the spirit of it. But in making that argument back, Hamilton kind of missed the point of what Brutus was trying to say. Brutus was saying they'll go beyond what's actually written down in the Constitution. So whether it says they can or can't do that in the Constitution is sort of irrelevant to them. They don't care what the document actually says, is the argument that he's making. So Hamilton's comeback is really kind of a weak one. And it wasn't very long thereafter that we began to see evidence that Brutus was the one that got this right, not Hamilton. You recall from earlier in this course, we discussed the case of Marbury versus Madison. In that case, there was a guy who wanted a government job. The official government didn't give it to him. He sued. He brought the case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court thought they could take that case because of a law that had been passed called the Judiciary Act, but it put them in a difficult situation, and so in the end, they ended up declaring the Judiciary Act unconstitutional. Now, when they did this, when they said, hey, anything that's against the Constitution we can strike down as void, they were asserting a power that they had not been given in the Constitution to declare things unconstitutional. It was a very important power that they were asserting. This power has become known as judicial review. And it what has enabled the courts to have a check on the other branches of government. But in a sense, it's the ultimate check. They're setting themselves up as the referee that can tell everybody else in government what they're allowed to do or not do. And they declared in Marbury versus Madison that this is their job and their job only to say what the law is. Fine, the Congress can pass a law, the president can enforce it, but in the end, the judiciary is going to decide whether that law is legitimate based on how they decide to interpret what it says. About 150 years later, this assertion of the Supreme Court, which they had now been doing for 150 years, that they get to decide what the law means and everybody else has to listen and obey them, was challenged in the case of Cooper versus Aaron. Cooper versus Aaron involved the desegregation of the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas in the late 1950s and the 1960s. What had happened was the United States Supreme Court had ordered the schools to desegregate. Now, what that means is that they had to become racially integrated. They had to let black students go to white schools, that sort of thing. But there was local opposition to this. And some local school boards, even some local courts said, oh, no, we don't have to obey this. Well, the case went up to the Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court got the case, they said, no. Citing Marbury versus Madison, it's our job. We are supreme in deciding what the Constitution means. And if we tell you the Constitution doesn't allow this anymore, you have to obey it. You have to listen to us and do what we say. Matter of fact, in Cooper versus Aaron, they went on to say that this principle of the Supreme Court telling everybody else what they're legally allowed or not allowed to do has become something that the public and the country's accepted and become an indispensable feature of our system. Basically, everybody's gotten used to having the Supreme Court around telling everybody else what they can and can't do. Therefore, everybody has to keep doing that, listening to the Supreme Court tell them what they can and can't do. Now, this role of the court in defining for everybody else what the law means is really an example of a basic conflict in our system. Earlier in this unit, we had a lesson where we talked about the common law, how it was developed in England to essentially fill holes in the law, where if somebody came into court, there was no law to cover what their situation was. The English judges in ancient times would make up something. And then those things that they made up, as they got used by other judges, they became precedents that the other judges followed, and this became the common law. And we called it judge-made law. Well, having the judges make law up is okay if there really isn't a law to cover that. But what about when there are laws to cover it? What if there's a constitution that sets rules for everybody in government? And then within the government itself, you have a legislature, the United States Congress, making laws to cover almost everything. At that point, the common law judges really don't have stuff to do other than to enforce what Congress has given them, enforce what's been written in the Constitution. But darn it, that's not nearly as fun. That doesn't make them nearly as powerful as they were under the common law system where they just got to make things up. And so there's an inevitable temptation for the judges to even start making up things under a statutory law system. Well, how they can do that? There's already a law in place. How can they just make stuff up? They do it now by reinterpreting the laws they've been given. They get a law, it doesn't say what they want, and they want to make something up that they think would be better. And so the way they get around that they actually have a law in front of them is they simply read it to mean something else that they think it should mean. So this common law impulse ends up getting used by judges to manipulate our statutory system, which means that we actually have laws written down. Well, they're going to manipulate those and say that they mean something different than what the plain words on the page say. Well, this idea that judges can do this, and perhaps even should be doing this, is called judicial activism. Now, the reason somebody might say that it's a good thing for judges to be judicial activists is they'd say, well, if the law doesn't say what it should say from a moral point of view, then why shouldn't the judges be able to come in and say it means something else in order to get people to do the morally right thing? Well, okay, but once you've accepted that, you've accepted the idea that we're going to have judges making up the law. We call this legislating from the bench. You've essentially accepted the idea that rather than having the legislature make the law, or perhaps even we the people make the law through the Constitution, We want to turn that authority over to judges because we consider them to be wiser, smarter, perhaps even more moral than the rest of us. So perhaps we get something wrong, like we create racial segregation as a people. The argument is we need judges to step in and force us to stop doing that bad thing. Well, but even if we accept that, there's still a problem. And that is that when judges do that, they aren't really applying a law anymore. Instead, they're engaged in what we can call results-oriented decision-making. Now, what we mean by that is an activist judge, when they get a case before them, they don't say, okay, what does the law say on this subject? What does the law allow or what does the law prohibit? Instead, an activist judge will look at the situation and say, what do I think is right or wrong? Who do I think should win or lose? And then once they figure that out, who they think they should win the case, then they work their ways backwards and say, okay, where can I find a law that says what I want it to say? Or where can I find a law for this situation that I can manipulate to make it say what I want it to say, to then justify the ruling that I already decided upon? Well, at that point, you don't really have judges applying the law anymore. Instead, in a sense, they're acting like kings making the law for everybody else. Now, if they're perfect kings, if they're all-wise kings, if they're wonderful kings, I guess that's okay. But what if you get kings, or in other words, judges, who aren't so wise anymore? The interpreting of the laws to mean what they want makes the courts powerful, obviously. But just how powerful does it make them? Earlier in this course, we talked about a man named Alex de Tocqueville. He was a sociologist who came from Europe to visit America in the early 1800s. He toured around and he wrote a very influential book about his journeys that described for many people what life was like in America at that time. In this quote from the book, he says that if there's an American aristocracy, now remember what that word aristocracy means from very much earlier in the course, if there's a small group of people that's kind of in charge telling everybody else in the whole country what to do, he says it is the judges, those who occupy the judicial bench and bar. You know what those terms bench and bar mean from earlier in this unit. The bench is where the judges would traditionally sit to hear cases, and the bar is that structure across a courtroom that separates the judges from everybody else. So he's saying the judges are this small group of people that is going to boss everybody else around in society. He reached this conclusion because as he looked around, he saw that just about any political dispute that was happening in America could be twisted around to become a judicial dispute. In other words, if you didn't like that somebody else was doing something to you politically, you could sue them. You could get in court. And if you got a favorable judge, they could simply declare that whatever that other person was doing to you is illegal or unconstitutional. So, American judges then could use this power of judicial review to declare things unconstitutional as a way to intervene in political affairs and take them over and become the ones who are really ruling society. We've talked about this concept previously in the course, and we talked about interest groups. And we referred to how some interest groups that may not be as powerful could go to court and just find sympathetic judges and win that way. Well, this is them making use of judges that are interested in intervening in political affairs, where they're a small group, they look around and they say, gosh, we think things should be this way politically. We don't have enough power, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough people. In other words, if we go and get this voted on, what we want, we'll always lose. And so what we do instead is we simply get the aristocratic judges to intervene, to show their power in society and order everybody else in society to do things the way we want. Now, some people didn't necessarily think that this was a good idea for judges to be this powerful. An example is a judge himself who was named Learned Hand. Oh, what a great name for a judge. Learned Hand was a judge in the United States in the middle of the 1900s. He's probably the most famous judge in American history who did not actually serve on the United States Supreme Court. Learned Hand likened the Supreme Court to Platonic guardians. Now, to know what he meant by that, I need to explain a little bit about what Platonic guardians are. The Greek philosopher Plato, who lived thousands of years ago, wrote a book called The Republic, where he described his perfect society. In Plato's perfect society, when children were born, they'd be taken away from their parents and raised in a state-run nursery. In this government-run nursery, then, the workers would watch the kids and figure out what they were talented at, and they would then make them go do those things. So if you had particular talents, you'd be assigned to be a farmer for the rest of your life. If you had other talents, you might be assigned to be a musician for the rest of your life. Had other talents, you might be assigned to be a doctor, that sort of thing. And the smartest kids in the nursery would be assigned to be the guardians, essentially the people that would be in charge of society and telling everybody else what to do. But Plato realized something. And this is actually real important as you consider whether or not this idea of judicial activism is a good thing or not. He realized that the people wouldn't necessarily like having a small group of the smartest people bossing the rest of them around and telling them what to do. And so in his republic, he thought that the guardians should lie to the people. They should fool them. They should let the people think that they were in charge without them actually being in charge. Like, for example, hold elections, let the people vote, while the whole time the guardians are rigging the election so that the person they want is the one that actually wins. Well, when Learned Hand looked at this possibility, he thought that's a bad idea. If he lived in a society like that, he wouldn't want guardians there, basically bossing everybody else around. He would want the freedom to be able to choose in his own life what he would want to do. Well, how is the Supreme Court like this? Well, the Supreme Court justices are supposedly selected because they're the brightest and wisest people in society. And then through this power of judicial review, they can manipulate the meaning of laws and of the Constitution itself to get whatever outcome they want. But if you went to the Supreme Court justices and asked them if this is what they actually do, hey, are you changing the meaning of things from what it actually means to what you want it to mean in order to get the outcome you want, even if that isn't what the voters or the other politicians want? They would say, oh, no, that's not what I'm doing, absolutely not. We simply enforce the law. That's what they would always say. They wouldn't want you to know that they're actually rewriting things. Learned Hand thought that was a bad idea. But there are other people who thought it was a good idea. An example is Woodrow Wilson, who would later become the President of the United States. At the time that he gave this quote, he was a political science professor. And he observed that the Supreme Court, in his mind, is a constitutional convention in continuous session. Now think what that means. What happened at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia that we talked about in one of the early lessons in this course? They wrote an entirely new constitution for the country. Well, when Woodrow Wilson says that the Supreme Court is a constitutional convention in continuous session, he is admitting that they are continually creating a new government for us. They are continually rewriting the Constitution. And he's okay with that the Supreme Court is there redrawing our laws for us all the time, without us even knowing. Like I said, they would never admit that they're doing this. But even the Supreme Court justice, before he actually became a Supreme Court justice, while he was a law professor, did admit this. Felix Frankfurter, who would later serve on the United States Supreme Court, while he was a law professor at Harvard, wrote this. He said, the Supreme Court is the Constitution. He was recognizing that whatever they say that document means, that's what it means for the rest of us. Now, think about the implications of this. The purpose of a constitution is to limit the power of government. Earlier in this course, we called that idea constitutionalism, that the powers of government could be limited. So that's what the Constitution does. It sets boundaries of government and says this is what you're allowed to do or not do. But how can that happen? How can you actually have boundaries around government if the government can constantly redefine its own powers? Which, remember, that's what the Supreme Court is doing through judicial review and judicial activism. They are constantly redefining the powers of government, constantly rewriting the Constitution. Well, as Thomas Paine observed in a quote that I think we had earlier in this course, if the government, the Supreme Court is part of the government, remember, can alter itself, in other words, redefine the boundaries of its powers found in the Constitution, then there is no Constitution, because the whole purpose of the Constitution is to set rules for the government. And if the government can change the rules anytime they want, why do we even bother to give them rules in the first place? So the Constitution's boundaries really should be set by we the people, the sovereign in our society. America is founded upon this premise that we call popular sovereignty, that the people are in charge and we set rules for the government. But who is actually sovereign if the government itself is redefining its own rules all the time? Which again, that's what the Supreme Court can do through judicial review and judicial activism for the reinterpreting the Constitution all the time. If they don't like where we the people set a particular boundary, they can simply move the boundary. And you have to wonder at that point, who's actually sovereign? Is it the people or is it the government? As a matter of fact, is it the Supreme Court within the government? So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What may a court do through judicial review? Does it supervise lower courts? Does it hear cases on appeal? Does it declare acts unconstitutional? Or does it evaluate other court opinions? Well, judicial review is when they declare something unconstitutional, the action of another court perhaps, but perhaps a Congress or the presidency or whatever it may be. What did Cooper versus Aaron rule? Did it rule that the court is supreme in defining what the law is? Did it rule that racial segregation is okay? Did it rule that judicial review is actually unlawful? Or did it rule that Congress defines the law? Cooper versus Aaron again declared that the Supreme Court is supreme in defining the law. Whatever Congress or the presidency or anyone else may say that the law means, the Supreme Court says they can always overrule them. What is judicial activism? Is it protests against the court? Is it parties trying to get into court? Is it interpreting laws to reach certain desired ends? Or is it judges asking for more cases? Judicial activism is judges interpreting laws to reach certain goals, certain ends that they want. What does this kind of judicial power conflict with? Does it conflict with the idea of limited government? With the idea of popular sovereignty? With the idea of constitutionalism? Or all of the above? It actually conflicts with all of the above. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will be from Unit 7, Lesson 13, about nurturing this power that the courts have.